Hey guys, tonight we're about to embark on a journey through time, one that takes us into the heart of history's most mysterious moments. You probably won't survive this trip without a few surprises and a couple of wait what moments along the way. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and the local time in the comments. Let's see how far this story can stretch across the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. We begin tonight's tale in the ancient deserts of Egypt, where towering pyramids have stood for thousands of years, casting their shadows over the sands like silent sentinels of time. The air is heavy with the scent of history, old, ancient, and full of untold stories. Egypt at its peak was a land of unimaginable power, filled with gods and kings, temples, and treasures. And then there are the pyramids, gigantic, awe-inspiring structures that still baffle historians to this day. As you stand before these monuments, you can't help but wonder, how did they do it? How did a civilization with limited technology, no cranes or bulldozers, manage to construct such vast structures with such precision? Some say slaves built the pyramids, their labor stripped of dignity and forced upon them by cruel rulers. Others, however, argue that skilled workers who may have been treated with respect built these structures. It's a debate that has raged for centuries, and one that historians still argue over. Were the builders slaves or skilled laborers? Was the construction of the Great Pyramid a feat of forced labor or an impressive demonstration of ancient Egyptian engineering? The answer isn't as simple as we'd like it to be, and the story of Egypt's greatness is far more complex than what history books often tell us. It's a story of gods, pharaohs, and mysterious practices, all intertwined in a tapestry that's as fascinating as it is elusive. There are whispers of lost knowledge, and the secrets of the afterlife, and legends of men who, in their quest for power, reached for immortality. Egypt was not just a kingdom, it was a realm where time and space seemed to bend, where the gods walked among mortals, and where everything had a purpose, even if that purpose is lost to us now. What is the true story of Egypt, then? Were these monumental structures a testament to human ingenuity, or were they the result of something far more mystical, something beyond human comprehension? Let's dive deeper into this enigma. And as we do, ask yourself, what lies hidden beneath the surface of history's most iconic monuments? As you sit in awe Staring up at the towering pyramids of Egypt, you can almost feel the weight of history pressing down upon you. These structures, monolithic, imposing, are not just stone and mortar. They are symbols of the divine created to honor gods and ensure the pharaoh's safe passage into the afterlife. For the ancient Egyptians, death was not the end, but a transition into a higher realm, a journey that could only be navigated by those worthy enough to enter the halls of eternity. But while the pyramids represent divine power, they also represent a kind of mystery that no one has fully cracked. How did the Egyptians manage to construct such complex structures? Some historians still debate the methods used to lift the heavy stones. How did they move these massive blocks, some weighing as much as 80 tons? Was it a secret technique? A forgotten knowledge lost to time? Or was it sheer manpower? A feat of engineering born out of necessity and survival. The theories abound, but the truth remains elusive, just out of reach. But Egypt wasn't just a place of incredible architectural feats. It was also a land filled with enigmatic rulers. Perhaps the most famous of these was Cleopatra, the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt. She's often depicted as one of the greatest beauties in history, the seductress who charmed Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, bending them to her will. But what if Cleopatra's true power wasn't her beauty at all, but her intelligence and political savvy? Historians still argue whether her legendary love affairs were the result of romantic desire or calculated political maneuvers designed to keep Egypt independent in a time of political turmoil. The truth about Cleopatra's influence is more complex than the simple narrative of beauty and love. In fact, Cleopatra wasn't just a queen in the traditional sense. She was a ruler who navigated the treacherous waters of Roman politics using her wit, charm, and knowledge of the Mediterranean world to secure Egypt's place on the world stage. It's easy to imagine her sitting on her throne, surrounded by advisors and diplomats, making decisions that would shape the course of history. But what about her true legacy? Historians still debate whether she was a visionary queen who fought for Egypt's independence, or simply a pawn in the power struggles of the Roman Empire. As you continue to ponder the legacy of Cleopatra, consider this. What if her true power wasn't just her ability to influence powerful men, but her mastery of the political landscape of her time? Could it be that she was more than just a seductive figure? Could she have been the mastermind behind Egypt's final stand against the encroaching Roman Empire? The question remains unanswered as historians continue to debate whether Cleopatra was a brilliant strategist or a woman caught in the tides of history. Now let's shift our gaze from the grandeur of Egypt to the raw intensity of ancient Rome. Picture yourself in the Colosseum, the scent of sweat and dust in the air, the roar of the crowd vibrating through the stone. The gladiators stand tall, their bodies scarred from battle, their eyes filled with both fear and determination. The games were about to begin, and the people were waiting with bated breath to witness the fight of a lifetime. Gladiators, those brave or perhaps desperate souls, fought not only for their lives, but for their honor, for their very survival. But what was the true nature of the gladiators' role in Roman society? Were they just brutal fighters thrown into the arena for the amusement of the masses, or did they hold a deeper place in the hearts of the people? Historians still argue whether gladiators were seen as heroes or as mere commodities. On one hand, they were trained warriors who fought with great skill and often earned the admiration of the public. On the other hand, many of them were slaves or criminals forced to fight for the entertainment of the Roman elite. Their lives were brutal, and their deaths often gruesome. But the spectacle they provided was undeniably captivating. The question remains, were the gladiators truly gladiators by choice, or were they simply pawns in the political and social games of Rome? But here's the twist. What if the truth about gladiators isn't as simple as we've been taught? What if, beyond the blood and violence, there was a complex relationship between the fighters and the empire they served? Some scholars argue that gladiators, despite their tragic circumstances, were treated as celebrities in certain parts of Roman society. They were recognized for their skill, their courage, and even their charisma. Some gladiators were able to buy their freedom, while others, after winning enough battles, were honored with lavish rewards. In many ways, they were the ancient world's version of modern-day sports heroes. As we continue this journey, let's not forget that Rome wasn't just about gladiators and bloody spectacles. It was a civilization filled with extraordinary people who shaped the course of history, for better or for worse. One of those people was Julius Caesar, a name that still resonates today as a symbol of power, ambition, and unyielding determination. But was Caesar a true hero, or was he just a man driven by an insatiable hunger for power? Historians still debate whether Caesar was a visionary leader or a ruthless dictator who used his political genius to manipulate his way to the top. Imagine the scene. Caesar standing before the Senate, his eyes cold and calculating as he listens to the murmurs of his enemies. He knew that his time was running out, and yet he pressed forward with the same fervor that had carried him through countless battles. Was he a hero in the eyes of the people, or was he a man consumed by his own thirst for power? His assassination by his closest allies, Brutus among them, speaks volumes about the fears his rise to power stirred within the Roman elite. But here's the question: was Caesar's death the result of political intrigue? Or was it the inevitable consequence of his ambition? As you ponder the dramatic fall of Julius Caesar, let's move from the grandeur of Rome to the harsh realities of the Crusades, a period steeped in violence, religion, and political power. Picture yourself in the midst of the 12th century, the air thick with tension and fervor. You're surrounded by knights in shining armor, their swords gleaming as they march towards the Holy Land. Their mission is clear: to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim rule. But what's the true motivation behind these holy wars? Was it purely religious zeal? Or were there deeper, more political reasons that drove the Crusaders to take up arms? Historians still argue whether the Crusades were truly about faith or whether they were driven by a thirst for power and resources. The Church, a powerful institution, declared the Crusades as a holy war. But beneath that banner of religion, there were territorial ambitions, desires for wealth, and the quest for political control. Many of the knights who took part in the Crusades were motivated by promises of land riches and titles, while the Church saw it as an opportunity to expand its influence and unite the Christian world under its rule. The irony, of course, is that the Crusades, intended to be a defense of the faith, led to some of the bloodiest and most destructive wars in history. But there's a deeper layer to the Crusades, something more personal and perhaps more spiritual. For many of the knights and common soldiers who joined the ranks, the Crusades were a way to secure their place in heaven, a way to make amends for sins, or even to achieve eternal salvation. In that sense, the Crusades were a complex mixture of religious devotion and personal ambition, each individual's motivations layered with both spiritual and material desires. While the Crusades may have been driven by these complex forces, there were also those who questioned whether this was truly God's will. Some saw the violent conquest of Jerusalem as an act of sin, not of divine purpose. This division of thought speaks to the greater question of how humanity interprets divine commands. Does religion inspire peace, or does it become a tool for war? And how do we reconcile the paradox that some of the most sacred wars in history have been fought in the name of God? Let's step away from the bloodstains of the Crusades and enter a more mystical world where battles are not fought with swords, but with ideas and belief. The Renaissance is where we'll journey. Next, a time of unparalleled intellectual awakening. Here, the grand tapestry of human potential unfolded in dazzling colors of art, science, and philosophy. Yet even in this period of enlightenment, the underlying darkness of human nature still lingered. The Renaissance, often seen as a golden age, was also a time of intense political maneuvering power struggles and the constant tug of war between faith and reason. While artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo painted masterpieces that still echo through history, many were also caught in a web of religious and political intrigue. And as the human spirit flourished, so did the questioning of religious dogma. Was the Renaissance truly a time of spiritual enlightenment? Or was it a revolution against the Church's centuries-old grip on knowledge and truth? As we delve into the Renaissance, think about the tension that arose during this time. The growing influence of humanism, celebrating human potential and reason, was at odds with the Church's dominance. Could the Renaissance have flourished without the power struggles of religion and politics? And in the end, did the Renaissance actually bring humanity closer to spiritual awakening? Or did it set the stage for deeper divisions and conflicts that would later erupt in the Reformation? As the Renaissance blossomed with its mix of awe-inspiring art and intellectual rebirth, the world was moving closer to a seismic shift in religious thought. The Reformation, sparked by Martin Luther's bold act of nailing his 95 Theses to the door of the Church in 1517, set Europe on fire. The flames of his protest spread quickly, challenging centuries of tradition and shifting the religious landscape forever. The Church, once the unquestioned power in the Western world, now faced a formidable challenge. But Luther's hammer wasn't just about the Church. It was about challenging the very nature of authority and belief. As we reflect on the Reformation, it's clear that the movement wasn't just about religion. It was about power, how it's wielded, who gets to hold it, and how it's used to shape human lives. Luther questioned the authority of the Pope, the indulgences, and the entire framework of Catholic dogma, arguing that salvation could not be bought or sold. But what followed this shift was a world of new conflicts as Protestantism took root, and the Catholic Church fought back with the Counter-Reformation, seeking to reclaim lost ground. The historical debate over whether the Reformation led to a deeper spiritual awakening or caused more harm through religious wars continues to this day. Was it the true liberation of the soul, or simply the start of a bitter division that still resonates in Christian denominations around the world? Let's pause for a moment to consider the broader implications of these shifts. These religious battles were more than theological arguments. They were wars fought over the souls of individuals and entire nations. In some ways, the Reformation revealed humanity's deepest fear, the loss of spiritual certainty. By questioning the Church, Luther and his followers didn't just open up a path to a different kind of spirituality. They opened up a dangerous rift in European society, one that would eventually lead to centuries of conflict, bloodshed, and division. But even as Europe burned with religious unrest, another force was beginning to stir just beyond the horizon, the age of exploration. This was a time when the known world seemed like a small island compared to the vast, uncharted oceans of possibility. The great explorers of the 15th and 16th centuries, Columbus, Magellan, Vasco da Gama, set sail into the unknown, driven by the promise of wealth, glory, and the spreading of Christianity. Their journeys would change the world forever. But at what cost? Was their mission truly about discovery? Or was it a veiled attempt at conquest? Historians still debate the moral implications of the age of exploration. On one hand, these explorations led to the expansion of knowledge, the exchange of goods and ideas, and the rise of new global economies. But on the other hand, these voyages brought untold suffering, as native populations were decimated by disease, war, and the imposition of foreign cultures. Was it truly a time of progress, or a dark chapter of imperialism that stripped entire civilizations of their identity? As we move into the 17th and 18th centuries, these questions become even more pressing. The age of exploration laid the foundation for the transatlantic slave trade, colonial exploitation, and the deepening chasm between the so-called civilized world and the rest of humanity. And yet, amid this darkness, the Enlightenment began to rise, an intellectual revolution that would challenge the very assumptions of authority, knowledge, and human potential. With the Enlightenment came a flood of new ideas as thinkers began to challenge the traditional structures of power that had governed society for centuries. The philosophers, the scientists, and the writers of the time questioned everything: the existence of God, the nature of truth, and the role of the individual in society. It was a time when reason and logic were elevated above blind faith, when people started believing that human beings could govern themselves independent of divine or monarchic rule. Figures like Voltaire, Rousseau, and John Locke sparked revolutions in thought, setting the stage for political upheaval and societal transformation. But in the midst of this intellectual flowering, there was also a growing sense of disillusionment as ideals of liberty and equality clashed with the realities of power and privilege. But here's where it gets interesting. While the Enlightenment was supposed to bring about the triumph of reason, it also created some serious contradictions. For all its talk of freedom and equality, the Enlightenment thinkers often overlooked the rights of women, slaves, and indigenous peoples. It's almost ironic that a period focused on the pursuit of knowledge and human dignity could also justify the subjugation of entire groups of people. Historians still argue whether the Enlightenment was the true foundation of modern democracy, or simply a philosophical exercise that didn't address the inequalities of its time. Were these intellectuals genuinely interested in liberty? Or were they simply using reason to justify their own privileges? In the shadows of the Enlightenment, the American Revolution was brewing. It was a revolution that would not only challenge the British Empire, but would also serve as a test case for the ideas of liberty, justice, and democracy. The United States, born out of the revolutionary fervor of the Enlightenment, was supposed to be a beacon of freedom. Yet, as history has shown, the reality was more complicated. Yes, the Founding Fathers crafted a constitution that promised equality, but they also upheld the institution of slavery and denied women the right to vote. The U.S. was a country built on the ideals of freedom, but it was also a country built on the oppression of marginalized people. Was the American Revolution truly a revolution of freedom? Or was it simply a reorganization of power? And then, in the late 18th century, the French Revolution erupted. The streets of Paris were filled with the cries of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The revolutionaries tore down the monarchy, executed the king, and declared the republic. It seemed like the dawn of a new age, a break from the old world of kings and serfs. But as the revolution grew more radical, the promises of equality were overshadowed by the violence of the Reign of Terror. Leaders like Robespierre, who once championed the rights of the people, became tyrants themselves. The revolution's noble ideals were often drowned in blood. And the question remains, was the French Revolution a triumph of freedom, or did it reveal the dangers of unchecked power? As we move into the 19th century, the waves of revolution continue to spread. The age of imperialism begins, and the question of freedom becomes even more complicated. The empire's reach extends across the globe, and colonialism becomes a new form of domination. But amidst this new wave of conquest, ideas about human rights, liberty, and equality continue to evolve. What started as a philosophical revolution becomes a political one, and as we approach the modern era, we are left to grapple with the tension between the ideals of liberty and the reality of how freedom has often been denied to those who need it most. As the 19th century unfolds, revolutions continue to change the face of the world. But a new conflict begins to rise, the clash between empire and the ideas of liberty and self-determination. This is the age when imperial powers, hungry for resources, land, and power expanded their dominion to every corner of the globe. The British Empire, in particular, was at its zenith, controlling vast swaths of land in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. But in the heart of these empires, the ideals of freedom, democracy, and equality, nurtured during the Enlightenment, began to unravel under the weight of colonial oppression. And so the question arises: can freedom truly exist when so many are subjugated by imperial powers? Was the age of empire simply the triumph of civilization and progress? Or was it a great contradiction? A period that heralded the very ideals of liberty while simultaneously denying them to entire populations. Colonialism and imperialism posed an inherent paradox. In one place, people were fighting for their own freedom and independence, while elsewhere, entire nations were being subjugated in the name of civilization. Take, for instance, the case of India under British rule. While the British Empire was a symbol of power, wealth, and industrial prowess, the people of India were living under oppression, with their resources plundered, their culture undermined, and their voices ignored. The struggle for Indian independence became a battle not just for political freedom, but for the recognition of human dignity. Figures like Mahatma Gandhi would rise to challenge this system, advocating for nonviolent resistance as the means to dismantle the empire and reclaim India's autonomy. But the question lingers. Did the rise of empires, these massive forces that shaped global history, actually pave the way for the movements that would one day seek to bring them down? Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States was grappling with its own contradictions. On one hand, it had become the land of liberty, the land of opportunity, where anyone, regardless of their origins, could rise to greatness. On the other hand, slavery still held an iron grip on the economy, particularly in the southern states. The Civil War, which would later engulf the nation, was not just a battle between North and South. It was a fight for the soul of the nation itself. Were the ideals of freedom truly realized in the United States? Or was there a great hypocrisy at play? The abolition of slavery, followed by the Reconstruction era, was supposed to mark a new beginning for Black Americans. But the reality was far more complicated. Despite the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which granted freedom, citizenship, and voting rights to formerly enslaved people, they were met with new forms of oppression: sharecropping, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, and the Jim Crow laws entrenched a system of racial segregation that persisted well into the 20th century. The question remains, when the United States proclaimed itself the land of the free, did it truly embody the freedom it promised? Or was it simply an ideal in need of constant struggle to bring it to fruition? As we step deeper into the 20th century, these struggles for freedom continue. The aftermath of World War I left the world reeling, and yet the seeds for future revolutions were already being planted. In Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution would dismantle the Tsarist regime, and communism would spread its ideology across the globe. Was the Russian Revolution a true victory for the people? Or was it merely the replacement of one form of tyranny with another? Did it free the people from oppression? Or did it open the door to a new wave of authoritarian rule under leaders like Joseph Stalin. The world had entered an era where the very notion of freedom was being redefined, no longer just the struggle for independence, but the struggle to reconcile individual rights with state power. To understand whether true freedom could ever exist within a system that required order and control. And the global stage was changing rapidly. The United States, emerging from the devastation of 2 world wars, would now become the leader of the free world, standing in opposition to the spread of communism. Meanwhile, Europe struggled with its own moral recovery, with the scars of war and totalitarian regimes still fresh on its psyche. But even as the world looked to the future, the question remained, what does freedom truly mean? And could the world ever achieve a universal freedom? One that is not divided by race, class, or nationality? As the 20th century progresses, the struggle for freedom continues to evolve with new challenges and new heroes emerging, but always carrying with them the lessons of the past, the constant eternal battle for the soul of humanity. As we step into the 20th century, we find ourselves facing one of the most complex and transformative periods in history. The world is caught in the aftermath of 2 world wars, each one more devastating than the last. Europe lies in ruins, the scars of conflict etched deeply into its landscape, while nations around the world grapple with the question of how to rebuild a fractured society. Amidst the devastation, however, a new force begins to rise, the idea of human rights, and the belief that freedom should not be a privilege reserved for a select few, but a universal right for all. In the wake of World War II, the United Nations was founded in 1945, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted in 1948. For the first time in history, there was a global recognition that all people, regardless of race, religion, or nationality, were entitled to certain fundamental freedoms and protections. But while this was a monumental step forward, the reality of achieving these rights was far more complex. The world was divided not only by ideologies, capitalism versus communism, but also by deeply ingrained social and racial divisions that prevented many from experiencing true freedom. Take, for example, the struggle for civil rights in the United States. While the country proclaimed itself the land of liberty, African Americans were still denied basic rights and faced systemic oppression. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s became one of the defining battles of the 20th century, led by figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and Malcolm X. But despite the progress made with landmark legislation, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the question remains, is true freedom ever really achieved for marginalized groups? Or is it simply an ongoing struggle to overcome the barriers that have been built into society over centuries. At the same time, the world is grappling with the rise of communism in the Soviet Union and China. The Soviet Union, under leaders like Stalin and later Khrushchev, presented itself as the champion of the working class, offering a vision of equality for all. Yet under this vision, millions of people suffered under oppressive regimes. The question here is whether communism as an ideology can truly deliver freedom, or whether it simply replaces one form of tyranny with another. The Cold War, a battle of ideologies that divided the world into East and West, raised this very question. And even now, decades later, historians continue to debate whether the Soviet Union's ultimate collapse was a victory for freedom, or simply the collapse of a flawed system that had promised too much. Meanwhile, as the world's attention shifted to these global struggles, another revolution was quietly unfolding, one that would have an impact on millions of lives: the feminist movement. The fight for women's rights began to gain momentum in the early 20th century, but it wasn't until the 1960s and 1970s that it truly began to challenge the deep-seated patriarchy that had dominated societies worldwide. The feminist movement fought not just for women's suffrage, but for reproductive rights, equal pay, and the right to control their own bodies and destinies. Yet, despite significant progress, gender equality remains an ongoing battle, with women still fighting for equal representation, rights, and recognition in many parts of the world. As the 20th century draws to a close, it becomes clear that freedom in its purest sense is not something that can be easily defined or achieved in any one generation. It is an ongoing struggle, one that involves constant questioning, constant challenging of authority, and a relentless push for a more just world. Every victory, whether it is the fall of oppressive regimes, the granting of voting rights to women, or the recognition of LGBTQ+ rights, represents a step forward. But even as we celebrate these victories, we must recognize that there are still battles to be fought, injustices to be corrected, and freedoms to be won. The question that remains is, what is the true meaning of freedom? And how do we ensure that it is a right for all, not just for a select few? The struggles of the 20th century provide us with valuable lessons, but they also serve as a reminder that the fight for freedom is far from over. It is a fight that requires vigilance, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to equality. As the world enters the 21st century, the global landscape continues to evolve, and the battle for freedom, justice, and equality intensifies. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 marked the end of the Cold War, symbolizing the victory of democratic ideals over totalitarianism. But as the world breathed a collective sigh of relief, the dawning of a new era also revealed new struggles. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the rapid expansion of global capitalism brought with it unprecedented wealth for some, but also deepening inequalities and the rise of new forms of oppression. In the wake of these dramatic changes, new conflicts arose. The war on terror, initiated after the September 11th attacks in the United States, shifted the geopolitical landscape and sparked debates on civil liberties, human rights, and the balance of security and freedom. In the name of national security, freedoms were restricted, and surveillance became a normal part of life for millions. The question remains, can a society truly remain free when it sacrifices privacy and liberty in the name of safety? How much freedom are we willing to give up for the illusion of security? These are questions that continue to haunt modern society. At the same time, the rise of technology and the digital age have raised new concerns about freedom. The Internet, once a symbol of democratization and free exchange of ideas, has now become a double-edged sword. On one hand, it connects us to the world in ways never before possible, enabling social movements, political activism, and the sharing of information across borders. On the other hand, it has become a platform for surveillance, censorship, and the spread of misinformation. The power of tech giants to control information and influence public opinion raises important questions about who controls our access to knowledge, and whether true freedom can exist in a world where digital platforms hold so much power. The emergence of global movements like Black Lives Matter and #MeToo has reignited the fight for equality, pushing against centuries of systemic oppression and demanding accountability from those in power. These movements, born from the struggles of marginalized groups, challenge the status quo and call for a world where freedom is not just an ideal, but a reality for everyone, regardless of race, gender, or background. But as these movements gain momentum, they also face intense opposition, revealing how deeply ingrained inequality remains in many societies. While the fight for freedom has made significant strides, it is clear that the battle is far from over. Meanwhile, climate change has emerged as a new frontier in the fight for freedom and justice. The environmental crisis affects the entire planet, but it disproportionately impacts the world's poorest and most vulnerable populations. The struggle for environmental justice is a fight for freedom. Not just freedom from oppression, but freedom from the destruction of the very resources that sustain life. As we move forward into the 21st century, it becomes clear that the fight for freedom must also include the fight for a sustainable future, where all people can live in harmony with the planet, and where future generations are not left to inherit a world ravaged by exploitation and greed. In this new age, the definition of freedom is being constantly reimagined. It is no longer enough to simply speak of political freedom or personal liberty. The freedom to live a life free from discrimination, from environmental destruction, from economic inequality. These are the freedoms that must now be championed. The question of whether freedom can be universal remains open, but one thing is certain. The fight for freedom is ongoing, and it will continue to evolve as the world changes. As we press further into the 21st century, one thing becomes abundantly clear. Freedom is no longer a static concept. It is not simply the absence of oppression or the right to express oneself without fear. It is now a complex web of intertwined issues: economic, environmental, and digital, all of which require our attention if we are to create a world where true liberty can flourish for everyone. Consider, for instance, the growing impact of automation and artificial intelligence on the workforce. As machines increasingly take over tasks previously performed by humans, there is an urgent need to question the future of labor economic freedom and social inequality. Will the rise of automation lead to greater prosperity for all? Or will it deepen the divide between the wealthy elite and the struggling masses? Historians and economists still argue whether technology has the potential to liberate humanity from the constraints of labor, or whether it will ultimately strip people of their livelihoods, making it more difficult for them to achieve financial freedom. These are the questions that loom over the future of work in a rapidly changing world. Simultaneously, the rise of authoritarian regimes and populist leaders in many parts of the world threatens the freedoms that have been hard-won over centuries. From Hungary to Brazil, from the Philippines to the United States, we are witnessing the erosion of democratic norms as leaders manipulate public sentiment and use power to suppress opposition, stifle the media, and silence dissent. In this context, the question is not just about the right to vote, but about the very structure of democracy itself. Can we ensure that the freedoms we cherish are protected when democracy itself is under siege? Is the fight for freedom now about more than just securing rights, but defending the very systems that allow freedom to exist? Yet despite these darkening clouds, there is reason for hope. Across the world, grassroots movements continue to rise, movements that demand justice, equality, and the protection of human rights. These movements, often led by young people who have grown up in a more interconnected world, are shaping the future in ways that were once unimaginable. Climate strikes, led by figures like Greta Thunberg, have sparked global conversations about environmental justice and the rights of future generations. Similarly, movements like Black Lives Matter have ignited a global reckoning with the legacy of racial injustice, calling for not just equality, but reparations and accountability for centuries of oppression. But while these movements have already made significant strides, they are not without their challenges. The fight for freedom is often met with resistance from those who benefit from the status quo, and the work is never easy. However, these movements are a powerful reminder that freedom is not a given. It is something we must actively work for, something that requires constant vigilance and the willingness to stand up against injustice in all its forms. In the face of these challenges, we must ask ourselves, how can we continue the fight for freedom in a world that is so deeply divided? How do we ensure that the victories we've won in the past don't slip away, and that future generations can inherit a world where their voices are heard, their rights are protected, and their freedoms are secure? The answer, as it has always been, lies in our collective action. It is up to us to shape the world we want to live in, to challenge the systems that perpetuate inequality, and to continue pushing for a more just and equitable future. The fight for freedom is ongoing, and it is a fight that will require all of us. The ideals that we hold dear, equality, justice, human dignity, must continue to guide us as we navigate the complexities of the modern world. But even as we face new challenges, we must hold fast to the belief that freedom is worth fighting for, that the ideals of liberty and justice are worth defending, and that together we can create a world where freedom is not a privilege for a few, but a right for all. As the 21st century unfolds, we find ourselves at a critical juncture in the ongoing struggle for freedom. With the rise of digital surveillance, the spread of misinformation, and increasing concerns over privacy, we are now facing a new frontier of freedom, the digital realm. The Internet, once heralded as the ultimate tool for democracy, now finds itself tangled in the webs of control, manipulation, and authoritarianism. Governments and corporations are increasingly collecting data on every aspect of our lives, using algorithms to predict our behavior, and often restricting the free flow of information. But here's the real question. Can we truly be free in a world where our every move is tracked, our preferences manipulated, and our personal information exploited? The rise of big tech companies has created a power imbalance that many fear will stifle the freedoms that the Internet once promised. Historians and digital rights activists are now grappling with the question of whether the Internet is still a tool for liberation, or whether it has become an instrument of control. In a world where freedom of expression is often compromised in the name of security, The very idea of freedom in the digital age is being redefined. Yet, despite these challenges, the digital age also holds an unprecedented potential for freedom. Social media has become a platform for activists to organize, mobilize, and amplify voices that might otherwise have been silenced. From the Arab Spring to the fight for LGBTQ+ rights, the Internet has empowered people to demand justice, to challenge oppressive regimes, and to build communities of support. However, these same platforms have also been used to spread hate, incite violence, and manipulate public opinion, leaving us with the uneasy question: can we trust the very tools that are meant to set us free? As we navigate this complex digital landscape, we must ask ourselves, how do we preserve the freedoms that the Internet once symbolized? How do we ensure that technology serves humanity and not the other way around? The answer lies not just in regulation, but in how we choose to use these technologies. It is up to us to shape the digital future, to protect our right to privacy, and to ensure that our voices remain free from the forces that seek to silence them. In the face of all this, we must also look inward. True freedom isn't just about what happens in the outside world. It's also about the freedom of the mind, the freedom of thought, and the freedom of our inner worlds. In a time when external forces can exert so much control, the greatest freedom may lie in the ability to remain true to ourselves, to think critically, to question the systems that try to define us, and to maintain our agency in a world that often seeks to strip it away. The struggle for freedom has always been about more than just physical liberty. It is about mental and spiritual liberation as well. As we fight to protect our rights in the digital realm, we must also fight to preserve the freedom of our minds. In a world that is constantly changing and evolving, one thing remains certain: freedom is a continual journey, one that requires constant awareness, action, and commitment. As we shift our focus from the digital age to the ongoing fight for freedom in the physical world, we come face to face with one of the most pressing issues of our time: climate change. The environment, once taken for granted, now faces unprecedented challenges, and the struggle for environmental justice has become an essential part of the broader fight for freedom. At the heart of this struggle lies a powerful question: who owns the earth, and who has the right to determine its future? In a world where corporations and governments hold much of the power, it's easy to forget that the planet belongs to all of us, and that our freedom to live healthy, sustainable lives is directly tied to the health of the environment. The question of environmental freedom is intricately linked to the rights of marginalized groups, particularly those in vulnerable regions that are often hit hardest by climate change. From rising sea levels to devastating natural disasters, the impacts of environmental degradation are disproportionately felt by the poor and disenfranchised. The fight for freedom, in this sense, isn't just about political rights. It's about the right to live in a world that is sustainable, equitable, and just. Those who suffer the most from climate change are often the ones who contribute the least to its causes. Yet they bear the brunt of its consequences. The movement for environmental justice challenges us to rethink the idea of freedom, asking whether true liberty can exist in a world where the planet's health is being compromised for short-term profit. Climate change forces us to confront the reality that our current model of progress, one that prioritizes economic growth over environmental protection, is unsustainable. Can we continue to justify the exploitation of the Earth's resources in the name of progress? Or is it time to reevaluate our relationship with the environment? Leaders like Greta Thunberg and movements like Extinction Rebellion have made it clear that the fight for freedom is now inseparable from the fight for a healthy planet. They call for urgent action to protect our world, to ensure that future generations have the freedom to live in a world that is habitable and sustainable. The question then is not whether we can afford to act, but whether we can afford not to. Can we allow our short-sightedness to jeopardize the freedoms of those who will come after us? Can we continue to live as if our actions today won't affect the world tomorrow? As we grapple with these questions, it's essential to remember that freedom in the modern age is not just about political rights or economic power. It's about our right to a livable planet, to clean air, to fresh water, and to the ability to thrive in a world that values people over profit. It's about understanding that freedom doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in relation to the world we live in and the way we treat the planet that sustains us. In the fight for freedom, environmental justice must be at the forefront of our minds. As we navigate the challenges of the 21st century, we must work to create a world where every person, regardless of their background or location, has the freedom to live a healthy and sustainable life. This fight is not just about protecting our planet. It is about protecting the very foundation of freedom itself. As we continue our journey through the evolving notion of freedom, we now find ourselves facing a deep reflection on the role of global power structures and how they intersect with the lives of everyday people. The 20th and 21st centuries have given rise to vast systems of governance, democracies, dictatorships, global corporations, all of which claim to act in the name of the people. But here's the ultimate question. When we talk about freedom in the context of these systems, are we truly free? Or are we simply beholden to those who hold the reins of power, whether it's a distant government, a corporation, or even a global system that dictates the terms of our existence. Take, for example, the rise of multinational corporations and their overwhelming influence on the global economy. Today, a handful of companies control the majority of the world's resources and markets. These companies, driven by profit rather than the welfare of the people, dictate how we work, what we consume, and even how we think. And as the power of these corporations grows, so too does their ability to manipulate governments, labor markets, and global policies. The question then becomes, can freedom truly exist when economic systems are structured in such a way that the powerful control nearly every aspect of life for the majority of people? Is it possible for an individual to be free when their economic future depends on the whims of faceless corporations? Historians and economists alike continue to debate the extent of corporate power and its influence on democracy. On one hand, advocates argue that free markets allow individuals to thrive through competition and innovation. On the other hand, critics contend that corporate monopolies suppress real competition and erode the autonomy of individuals. In a world where decisions are made not by the people, but by a few corporate giants, does the freedom of the individual even stand a chance? How do we balance economic freedom with the need for greater equity, so that people are not enslaved by a system that benefits the few at the expense of the many? And yet, even in this seemingly bleak landscape, we see moments of hope. Around the world, people are challenging these power structures, fighting for worker rights, pushing for sustainable practices, and demanding a more equitable distribution of resources. Movements like fair trade, worker cooperatives, and ethical consumerism challenge the very foundations of the corporate-driven global economy. But while these movements are gaining traction, they are also up against fierce opposition from the very systems they seek to dismantle. The question once again is, how do we ensure true freedom when the global system is stacked against us? As we dive deeper into these questions, it becomes apparent that freedom in the modern world is not a singular, static concept. It's fluid, ever-changing, and often comes with contradictions. While some may experience unprecedented levels of freedom and wealth, others find themselves trapped in systems of exploitation, their rights disregarded, and their voices unheard. In a world that constantly shifts between global crises, economic inequalities, and political turbulence, how do we carve out space for true, unencumbered freedom? The struggle for freedom today is not just about breaking free from physical shackles. It's about breaking free from the systems that control our access to knowledge, our ability to live with dignity, and our right to live in a world that values people over profit. It's about taking back power from the forces that seek to limit our potential and dismantling the structures that perpetuate injustice. The battle for freedom is ongoing, and in a world where inequality, exploitation, and oppression still exist, it's a battle we cannot afford to lose. As we reflect on these questions, we find that the struggle for freedom is inextricably linked to one of the most pressing issues of the modern age: the fight for social justice. It is no longer enough to simply acknowledge freedom in theoretical terms. In today's world, freedom must be a living, breathing reality for all people. It must be felt not just in the abstract, but in the concrete, experienced in our daily lives, our interactions, and the opportunities we are afforded. One of the most compelling movements in the fight for social justice is the ongoing battle for racial equality. The question of whether true freedom exists for marginalized communities is one that is still very much alive today. The civil rights movement of the 1960s, led by figures like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks, brought the fight for racial equality to the forefront of American consciousness. Yet even decades later, the fight for racial justice continues as systemic racism remains deeply embedded in social, economic, and political structures. While the landmark victories of the civil rights movement, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, were pivotal steps in dismantling formal segregation, the fight for true equality is far from over. The rise of the Black Lives Matter movement has shone a light on police brutality, mass incarceration, and the deep inequalities that persist in America and around the world. Despite progress, the question remains: can freedom truly exist when racial injustice continues to plague society? Are we truly free when entire communities are still marginalized, denied the same opportunities and protections as others? And it's not just about race. The struggle for gender equality is equally important. For centuries, women were denied basic rights and freedom: the right to vote, the right to work, the right to control their own bodies. Though progress has been made, the fight for women's rights continues to this day. The #MeToo movement, which gained momentum in the late 2010s, brought to the forefront the widespread issue of sexual harassment and gender-based violence. Women continue to fight for equal pay, reproductive rights, and an end to violence and discrimination. Yet, in many places around the world, these battles are still being fought on the front lines as women struggle to achieve the same freedoms and opportunities as men. The fight for freedom, then, is not just a political battle. It's a battle for human dignity. It's about the fundamental belief that every individual, regardless of their race, gender, or background, deserves the same opportunities, rights, and freedoms, whether it's racial justice, gender equality, or the protection of marginalized communities. The question remains, how do we create a world where true freedom is accessible to all? How do we ensure that the promise of liberty is not just an ideal, but a reality for everyone? And then there is the issue of the environment. It's no longer enough to simply fight for political freedom or equality. We must also fight for the freedom to live in a world that is healthy, sustainable, and just. The fight for environmental justice is just as important as the fight for civil rights or gender equality. Environmental degradation disproportionately impacts those who are already marginalized communities of color. Low-income families and indigenous peoples are often the first to bear the brunt of environmental destruction. Climate change, deforestation, pollution, and resource depletion are not just environmental issues. They are social justice issues. The question of environmental justice is inseparable from the fight for freedom because it impacts the very foundation of our existence. Can we truly be free if we live in a world that is being destroyed around us? As we stand at this crossroads, it's clear that the battle for freedom is more complex than ever. It is not just about political rights or economic opportunities. It is about ensuring that all people, regardless of their race, gender, or background, have the freedom to live with dignity, to live in a world that is healthy and sustainable, and to live without fear of discrimination, violence, or oppression. The fight for freedom in the modern world requires us to confront the deep-rooted injustices that still exist in our societies, and to work toward a future where all people can truly be free. But how do we move forward? The path to true freedom is long, and it is not an easy one. It requires us to challenge the systems that perpetuate inequality, to fight for justice in all its forms, and to envision a future where liberty is not just a privilege, but a right for all. The fight for freedom is a never-ending journey, and it is one that demands our attention, our commitment, and our compassion. The fight for freedom, as we have seen, is a journey that spans centuries and continents, shaped by wars, revolutions, and social movements. As we find ourselves in the present day, the struggle is more complex than ever before. With the forces of global capitalism, political authoritarianism, and environmental destruction converging on every side. The question we must ask ourselves is not just how we define freedom, but how we protect it for future generations. The struggles of the past have paved the way for progress, but they also reveal how much work remains to be done. And as we stand at this critical juncture, we are faced with a daunting challenge. How do we ensure that the freedom we now have is not lost, but expanded to include those who have been left behind? The world is more interconnected than ever, and yet inequalities persist in every corner of the globe. In the face of rising authoritarianism, it's clear that freedom is a fragile thing. Political leaders with populist agendas, often fueled by fear and division, are using the promise of security to strip away the freedoms that have been fought for over generations. The expansion of technology has brought new freedoms, access to information connection to others. But it has also raised new concerns about surveillance censorship and the erosion of privacy. As we move forward, we must ask, how can we protect our freedoms in an age where power is so concentrated, where the lines between private and public are so blurred, and where the very tools that empower us can also be used to control us? And then there is the environment, the issue that binds all others together. The earth is our shared home, and yet it is being exploited at an unprecedented rate. As climate change accelerates, the freedoms of millions are threatened, particularly those in vulnerable communities who are most affected by environmental destruction. From rising sea levels to extreme weather events, the fight for environmental justice is also a fight for freedom. The right to clean air, safe drinking water, and a stable climate is no longer a luxury. It is a basic human right. The struggle for freedom then must also be a struggle to protect the planet, to ensure that future generations inherit a world where they can live with dignity, where their basic needs are met, and where the earth is cared for and preserved. As we look ahead, the task before us is daunting, but it is not without hope. The history of freedom is a history of struggle, but it is also a history of resilience. Every victory, no matter how small, is a step forward, and each time we stand up for justice, equality, and human dignity, we are continuing the work of those who came before us. The road ahead may be long, but it is a road that we must walk together. The fight for freedom will not be won overnight. It will take all of us working together, fighting for the world we want to create. So as we close tonight's journey, remember this: the struggle for freedom is not just about securing the rights we already have. It's about ensuring that everyone has the same opportunity to experience freedom, to live with dignity, and to thrive. The fight is ongoing, and it is one that will take many forms. But in the end, the power to create a more just world lies with us all. We must continue to fight, continue to ask the hard questions, and continue to push for a world where freedom is a universal right, not a privilege for the few. Now, as the night settles around you, and the quiet hum of the world fades into the background, let yourself drift into a sense of peace, knowing that the journey toward freedom is far from over and that you are a part of it. Together, we can create a world where liberty, equality, and justice are not just ideals, but realities for all.